Okay. So let's begin, please. And we are going live. Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome everyone at home. Thank you for joining us in Israel, in the United States, and anywhere in the world, right? I know we're going live right now, but a lot of people are going to be viewing this afterwards also on our social media, on YouTube. So welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. Really, this is part of what we call CSUS Global Conversations. In the last couple of years, partly because it's become more difficult due to the war to have guests come from the United States to Israel and to kind of engage in these discussions. So we've, harnessed the advantages of social media. There are many advantages, of course, and this is one of them. So this is kind of our attempts to expand the conversation using these online platforms, and this is kind of another great example of CSUS Global Conversations. So we're very fortunate and happy to have this wonderful panel here tonight to discuss something which I know is of great importance, maybe even concern, certainly to myself, to the panelists, but I imagine also to many of you at home. And that is the future of U.S. Israel relations, especially now, right, in the wake of a war that does not seem to be over, right? It's this temporary kind of, we're in purgatory. We're not sure where this is going, but we are 2 months and a week already, right? 7 weeks into this war, 9 weeks, excuse me, 9 weeks into this war. And even, we're not sure how that is going to pan out, of course, but it does seem that Israel, at least U.S.-Israel relations, might actually be one of the unintended casualties of this war. So tonight, I want to welcome my colleagues, my friends, and a wonderful set of experts to discuss this. I want to briefly introduce everyone. I'll do it alphabetically, and then we'll just get right into it. I know there's a lot to discuss. I'll leave some time at the end for questions, which all the questions can be kind of sent to our social media accounts. Mostly, if you have a Facebook account, you can just go to Center for U.S. Studies at Tau on Facebook, right? You can find that. You can just Google Center for U.S. Studies, CSUS at Tau on Google, and you could reach us either through social media or email if you have questions, and then I'll pose it to the panel. All right, so just briefly, we are fortunate to have 3 experts who have written so much about U.S. Israel. I think that this ability to collect all of their knowledge here will undoubtedly generate, I think, a lot of insight, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them. I will, since they've written so much, our panelists are so prolific, I'll just mention the relevant works and the relevant books for our topic today of U.S.-Israel relations. I'll go alphabetically. Motti Inbari is professor of religion at University of North Carolina, Pembroke, a leading scholar of Jewish and Israeli studies. His teaching and research focuses on Jewish history, thought, and culture, with expertise in Jewish politics, ethics, gender, sexuality, and Jewish-Christian relations. His most recent book, which made headlines a few years ago, I'm sure you've probably come across it, is Christian Zionism in the 21st Century, published together with Kirill Bumin. And that book highlighted the waning support among young evangelicals for Israel. I'm sure Motti has a lot. He has new research, he has new data, so we'll discuss that. But that, I think, is a very relevant book to where we are today. Our second guest is Professor Yossi Shain. He is Professor Emerita of Political Science at Tel Aviv University, former head of Tau's School of Government, Political Science, and International Relations. Yossi's research spans numerous fields, including ethnicity, diaspora relations, law, Jewish civilization, and political leadership. He's also the founding director of the Program for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. Yossi is currently working on a new project focused on victimhood, right, and the politics of victimhood. His most recent book, published in both Hebrew and English, was the Israeli Century: How the Zionist Revolution Changed History and Reinvented Judaism. And Yossi was, of course, also a former member of Knesset from Israel Beitenu. And our third panelist is Dov Waxman. Waxman is a professor of political science, chair of Israel Studies, and the former director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dov's research and writing focuses on Israel-Palestine, anti-Semitism, Israeli politics, Israel diaspora relations, and U.S. Israel relations. Among his many books, I think the most relevant, for today's discussion is Trouble in the Tribe, which I think anticipates this moment, right? And Dov, I think, is one of the first scholars to notice this over a decade ago, and it really is a terrific book for understanding what's happening within the American Jewish community. And Dov's current forthcoming book, also with Princeton University Press, is The Question of Anti-Semitism, a guide for a world divided by Israel-Palestine. All right, so I look forward to what promises to be a very stimulating conversation. And I want to start with Yossi. You just came back from the U.S. You were one of the few Israelis who were fortunate enough to fly out and back during the Iran war, right? When Ben Gurion Airport was closed. And also as someone who has been studying and writing about U.S.-Israel relations for, I think we could say nearly a half a century, right? Nearly. And who also...
You're reminding me of lots of things right now, yes.
And also someone who, on the practical policy level, helped, oversee and lead policy in Israel's Knesset when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations. I wanted to start with, what is your assessment looking back of the state of the relationship today, especially, in the wake of everything that's happened in America due to the Iran war?
Look, first of all, thank you, Yoav, for having us, and to all my colleagues here. This is a big question you're asking me, and I'll try to see where we are now. The moment we are speaking is a moment of incredible importance. On the one hand, we see the most intimate relations between America as a superpower and Israel as a state on all levels. I don't think there was any other state in the world since World War II which had such intimate relations on the battlefield and diplomatically, especially between the administration in Washington and, of course, the government of Israel. This culminated, of course, in the war that we are now witnessing in Iran. It began, of course, in last June, but this is a remarkable moment that one cannot underestimate in terms of the alliance between the two countries, especially if we take into consideration the alliance with the War Department, as they now call it in the United States, and Israeli military echelon, and many other aspects of the Israeli, we call it the military complex of Israel, the intelligence agencies, and the United States. So this is a tremendous moment in terms of the closeness. And yet we are, and many of us fear that this is perhaps the last moment of this closeness, and there is nothing in between the closeness and the possible collapse, which is quite interesting. On the one hand, we have this closeness, the two countries are engaged in war, and you have this articulation of the Secretary of War, Haxett, and the President of the United States about our closest ally, and yet you have 40 members of senators in the American Senate, Democrats, who are voting against or voting for boycott Israel in terms of weapons and all other sorts of support that America provides for Israel. And in addition, of course, we see what is happening on American media, the tensions that exist vis-a-vis American Jewry, the fact that many people are flying away or from the support of AIPAC in the upcoming midterm elections, and so on and so forth, that everybody is listening to and watching these voices. This is also a reflection not only of these relations, it's a reflection of what is happening domestically in the United States in the rupture between Democrats and conservatives. albeit not all Democrats and not all conservatives. As we know, also, there are conservative voices in America who become very hostile, and yet there are some Democrats who remain very loyal to Israel and so on. And also a reflection of the changes that have taken place in Israel with this current government, and we are before the October elections here.
Yeah.
So this is the moment that many people are witnessing with either heroic kind of language and of closeness or trepidation of collapse of relations.
Yeah.
It's a psychological moment. It's a moment that we don't know where it will take us. It's all also involved in personalities. It's not just a structural moment. We have to, and this will be my last sentence, I want my colleagues to speak. There is a whole issue here in Israel and the United States between structure and agency. There is certainly the case of the relation between the United States and Israel on a structural level, historically speaking, notwithstanding the presidents and notwithstanding members of Congress. And of course, there's the agency, the players. There is no one remembers such a player like Donald Trump in that relations. And of course, Netanyahu as a player in a different fashion, and also someone who have tremendous amount of support on the one hand and tremendous amount of enmity and alienation on the other hand. So on this account, I think we're in a moment that lots of things are hanging, and it relates to really where we are moving in the next few months. This will determine a lot of things. It's not just a regular time, it's a time of unique opportunities and also very, very dangerous moments for these relations. And my last sentence, if we had like several years back, Dennis Ross's book about this kind of unbroken alliance and that he wrote about, his book about the Israel-American relations, I think we are here into a completely different posture, and yet to be seen how it will evolve. I don't want to make any prediction at this moment. I have some thoughts about it, but I would.
Well, all right, so we'll get to that to the future.
Yes.
So I really
I think this is kind of like the big
Yeah.
dilemma that I put, or the relations that are.
So-
This is what informed the relation at this moment.
So thanks, Yossi. So I want to highlight just the paradox that Yossi was
Yes,
emphasizing,
it's a
right?
paradox or maybe a conflict, whatever. Yes.
Right, because on one hand, the strategic military intelligence relationship is at a new level, right? And really, since World War II, the United States has not gone to war. I can't, maybe NATO, right? We can think of NATO allies.
Not
in
in
the
that,
90s.
not in
Right,
such a
okay.
manner.
So never in such a manner. So you have really an unprecedented military strategic technological, right? You took the military industrial complex alliance, but at the very same time that the external relationship has been really cemented, the domestic support for that said relationship it seems to be collapsing in an unprecedented manner, right? And that's where we are. So I want to kind of lunge into that more specifically, because both Dov and Motti have, I know they have research, they have data about this, which is relatively recent. So I would like to kind of ask Dov and Motti, let's say Dov, well, we can start with you, right? I know you have a forthcoming book out about this. I mean, how has the Iran war in your mind affected both U.S. Israel relations, and especially I know anti-Semitism is so central to what you're looking at.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Yoav, for bringing us together to discuss this issue. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So I think the war in Iran has reinforced and accelerated existing trends that were well underway before the war. But I think the impact has been most pronounced thus far on Republicans. I would say that the collapse of support for Israel among Democrats has been a process that's been happening for some time, and really accelerated dramatically during the war in Gaza. And now we're seeing a shift occurring on the Republican side. I don't want to exaggerate the impact that this is having on policy toward Israel. I think we need to make a distinction between what's happening on the kind of societal level in terms of public support and policy, not only, as Yossi said, in terms of the high level of coordination and obviously the alliance between the two governments, but also in Congress. We're not seeing as yet Republicans in Congress really shifting their position. I mean, there's been this vote that I think Yossi alluded to a few weeks ago, where a significant number of Senate Democrats voted against providing Israel with bombs and bulldozers, and that there was a significant increase from just the year before, Senate Democrats opposing weapons sales, arms sales to Israel. That hasn't occurred among Republicans. So while I think there are shifts on the grassroots, and there are, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the very vocal voices on the far right, in Congress at least, and in the upper echelons of the Republican Party, there is still, rock solid support for Israel. But I think what is very clear, it was already apparent before the beginning of this war, but it's really become even more apparent since then, is that the age of kind of bipartisan American political support for Israel is over. We're not going to be going back to that period. I think I agree with Yossi that this is a turning point. In many ways, it is both the apex of, not APAC, but apex of the U.S. Israel alliance, and also the beginning of a shift in that relationship. In terms of the issue of anti-Semitism and how this comes into play, it's one of the things that struck me. I've been working on this book about anti-Semitism and the politics of anti-Semitism and questions of anti-Semitism in the context of Israel-Palestine. But one of the things that struck me as soon as the war broke out was the immediate, discussion about this being a war for Israel. And of course, the senior figures in the Trump administration, most notably U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, kind of fueled this discourse. Rubio immediately came out in early March, shortly after the war began, and said basically, we were forced to act. We were forced to engage in this war with Israel because Israel was going to do it anyway. And if we didn't, join them, then we would have suffered higher casualties later, would have been dragged into it. Although he subsequently walked back that comment, and other figures, including Trump himself, have pushed back against that idea that it was a war for Israel, that has become very prominent part of the debate around this war in the United States. This is an unpopular war in the US. And the argument that this has been really driven by Israel and it's serving Israel's needs has become very widespread. And that now, I want to be clear, that in itself is not an anti-Semitic claim. It's not anti-Semitic to highlight Netanyahu's role in persuading Trump to initiate this war, and it's not anti-Semitic to criticize the US, Netanyahu's influence on Trump, or the US role in American decision-making. But it's very easy to stray from that into allegations that somehow this is indicative of Jewish control over the American government, or some sort of nefarious conspiracy that Israel has orchestrated. And so, this kind of discourse is happening on the back of what's already been a long rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. And so one of the things that makes this a particularly kind of perilous moment, I think, is that not only is the terms of the US-Israel relationship being renegotiated, at least on the American side, and there's much more scrutiny of that relationship, but it's also occurring in a context in which Jewish Americans are increasingly concerned about domestic anti-Semitism. They've suffered the kind of, over the last few years, as a result of surging anti-Semitic incidents since the outbreak of the war in Gaza. And now this kind of discussion and allegations about, Jewish conspiracy or Jewish control being behind the Iran war. And so I think the overlap now between these domestic fears and understandable fears that Jewish Americans have, and the debate now about the US-Israel relationship, I think makes this debate in the US context particularly fraught one.
Yeah. We'll come back into a lot of the specifics that you mentioned. You mentioned the left, you mentioned anti-Semitism, and of course, then it is important to emphasize that these conspiracies have always been there, right? And Dov mentioned this. I'm working now on a big project on the history of the American rights relationship with Israel, and this, of course, it predates 48, And certainly after 1948, it was always there. And it peaks every time, right? There's that the geopolitical context facilitates it. So, of course, the Iraq War in 2003 was a big moment. The first Persian Gulf War, we already forget about that in 1990, 1991. That was a moment of when Pep Buchanan, right, when a lot of people on the American right were suddenly woken and pointing to Israel as to blame, right? But as Dov said, here we have, I think, the convergence of these forces, because and you have Gaza and you have everything happening on the American left, and social media and Trump, and then everything suddenly boils to this new moment, which is unprecedented. So kind of Motti, right? I want to kind of come back to you and the question of what is happening on the right, especially among evangelicals, right? Your book from a few years ago, and we've had we've had Motti quite a few times at the center to share his data, because he's really pointed to a very surprising transformation among younger generations of evangelicals. So Motti, how do you see the war's effect? And you can also think more broadly about the Gaza war's effect on the right, especially young evangelicals that you've been following so long.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for inviting me again. And to unpack it, I need a few layers of unpacking. So first of all, I want to say to Yossi, if I can, maybe the only way is down now. If you reach such a high, the only way is down. So maybe this is something we need to expect. But because I've been in the last 8 years or so, I've been measuring grassroots support for Israel among American Christians. I started this big project with evangelicals, and this project has expanded to other Christian movements in the United States, among them Catholics, mainline Protestants, and I also conducted one survey among American Jews just before the war broke out. So I don't have the impact of the war on Jews, but we have studied public opinion by conducting surveys before the war, during the war, and after the war, among some of these groups, not all of them, among some of these groups. And I have to tell you that the numbers do not show a major collapse or a major anything of that sort as the result of the war. And we need to understand why. So running the statistical regressions shows that the most important view of why Americans who identify as Christians exhibit support for Israel, and I can give like a big picture of how the numbers look, is because of the view that Jews are God-chosen people. So typically, we don't inject those things into those surveys. So we don't understand their impact. But once we are injected religious questions into surveys of understanding public opinion in America toward Israel and Jews, and you ask religious questions, you're starting to see something different. And I just want to say, about 70% of all Americans identify as Christians. Yes, and when asking those questions about, do you believe that Jews are God-chosen people? And do you believe that the Jewish people is entitled for the land of Israel as a result of the promise God made with Abraham? And you are starting to ask these questions, you see there's a very wide support for those statements. By the way, Dov, also among Jews. Have you ever asked Jews if they think that they are God-chosen people? Well, you should ask, and then you'll be surprised to see how significant it is. And so if you want to try to unpack what makes American Christians support for Israel, let me give you the numbers, because different group, we realize different group, not necessarily identical. And there's a big divide between Protestants and Catholics. Catholics are of a lesser support for Israel than Protestants. And then within the Protestant label, there are evangelical, there are mainline Protestants. So it's not one group. But overall, Protestants do support Israel in a much larger numbers than Catholics. So overall, the numbers are about 50%. We asked, the question first. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, where do you place your support? This is the question. And we give from very strong support for the Palestinians to a very strong support for Israel. And there's a middle, support neither, and I don't know. And the number tend to look at about 50% say that they support Israel, 40% say that they support neither, and 10% say that they support the Palestinians.
So this is among Protestants or evangelicals?
This is the all together, everyone,
Christians.
Catholics, evangelicals, mainline Protestants. And now we asked this question before with evangelicals and about 25% of all Americans identify as evangelicals. And then I think the number is even higher than that. Before the war, during the war, and after the war, the numbers stayed the same. No change at all.
But what happens, right? Because your book, right, and here's you have to, concede, right? The great finding of Motti's book from a few years ago was that younger evangelicals, and that's the key, right? Under 30, I think, or under 40, are far less committed to Israel, right? Yes. And that down the road, of course, has strategic ramifications, given how central the evangelicals are for the GOP's base. They are the most important part of the GOP's base, and they have been since 1980, since Reagan's conservative revolution. So what happens when we look at age groups among evangelicals, Motti?
So now I have a bigger picture. Yes, I have Catholics, I have mainline Protestants, I have Jews, and this is a generational thing. You cannot isolate only evangelicals or only Jews or only Catholics or only other Protestants. This age group is the least supportive of Israel among, of Americans. Yes. And as you go by the ages, you see the support grows higher and higher. And let me just give you one number, because we're talking about American strike on Iran. So the last survey we've conducted, we asked about the previous one that happened 8 months ago.
Yeah,
yes. And so the survey was among Protestants, evangelicals and mainline. And it was after the war. And 40% supported the strike, 25% opposed the strike, 10% never even heard of it. Yes, that's to understand America, yes? Yeah. Never even heard of it. And then there were 25% who said they have no opinion on it, yes? But when you start breaking down the ages, you see that those who oppose that strike on Iran are mostly coming from the youngest cohorts.
Right. And
as you go by,
and that's very consequential, right? The demographics. Right. So we'll come back, because I want to talk with you about the Catholics as well, which I think we don't talk enough about that. But I want to come back to this point that both Dov and Yossi mentioned indirectly. How much of a role does Israel have, right? Because we were talking about Democrats, we're talking about Rashida Tlaib and AIPAC and all this, but we have to recognize also that Israel, and especially this Netanyahu government, and I say this Netanyahu government because it is very different than every Netanyahu government before, the one that when was this, that from 2022, right? The November 22 government that Netanyahu sets up with Ben Gvir and Smotrich. So Yossi and Dov, I'd love to hear how you see the role of Israel as is it a causal factor in the undermining of the relationship, or is it just larger demographic forces in America, and in a way that is almost destined? Dov,
I would like to stay still a little bit, like in kind of a top of the floor, and if we can a little bit, let me go back to some details here. Look, we describe this kind of like what you call a paradox between the most intimate relations and the greatest trepidation of a breakdown and a distance, and the distancing, especially in the public opinion. And indeed, without making reference right now to what Motti or Mordechai has said, we saw the Gallup polls, the latest Gallup polls, and we saw, of course, Pew, and we see this kind of like tremendous decline in the traditional support of Israel.
So overall, right, we're talking
overall
about the
decline, and many people are incredibly alarmed by that, and this is in conjunction also of the anti-Semitic attacks or the demonstrations in almost on October 8th against Israel, sort of like the rallying against Israel after the October 7th. and sort of like the what I will call the fatigue Israeli factor, which also Dov mentioned, that is now creeping into the Republican, like the Tucker Carlsons and so on. Someone, we're kind of like tired of Israel. This is something which is very important. You ask me, what is it? We can unpack it. I think I would like to make several points. And it's not by mistake that I mentioned Dennis Ross's book, because when he wrote the book, he was speaking about doomed to succeed. I forgot the title. So now, doomed to succeed. Are we really doomed to succeed? So first of all, I think there is a huge gap between two things that have happened in Israel-American relations that relate to Israel and, of course, to the perception of Israel. One is the huge gap between Israel as a victim and Israel as a superpower. How do you reconcile a country which claims to be a superpower and can attack Iran and can fight against Hamas and can fight in Lebanon and consider itself to be the most powerful nation, perhaps only after the United States, and at the same time claiming victimhood? This kind of gap is becoming untenable in the minds and hearts of many, and who have replaced, of course, and made lots of manipulation about Israel, not only as a superpower, but as a perpetrator of genocide. This is kind of like, and this is a huge issue for Israel, because 80 years after the Holocaust, or 81 years, whatever, it's very difficult to hold this kind of like gravity of the victim. Israel cannot sell itself as a victim. Even after October 7th, it doesn't hold water. It doesn't, it takes time to understand. No one cares about what Hezbollah is doing or Hamas is doing. Like you're the guys who are destroying buildings in Gaza or in Lebanon, whatever. You're too powerful to claim victimhood. This is a very important factor that I'm writing about, this kind of like gap that has emerged from the, and then there is, of course, as you describe, and is about the shifting nature of American identity and Israeli identity over the years, and the perception of Israel. On the one hand, there is another question here. Once we are describing the idea that Israel is, in Israel, we're talking about Israel as a client state. Many people say, look at this. When was the last time that Israel could not attack in Lebanon because our hands are tied? That Trump is, in fact, dictating to us what to do. In the United States, however, America is being presented as a client state of Israel. Think about it. Those who are client state of Israel or the Jewish lobby, these are two different perceptions. So what is really happening here? I think everything is happening here. First and foremost, we are tied, and we don't know how this kind of like linkages can hold. We see difficult linkages that America has with NATO, with England, and others. We have not talked about them. How long we can hold this formula of special relations? This is a very big issue, which is in the higher. In terms of the public opinion, I already alluded to it. It's very difficult to hold the idea of a victim. And this is because of academics, because of the rupture between the left in America, progressives, and the right in America, all of these issues. And with regard to Israel, there's also a huge gap between what some in Israel want to sell to the world as a country that is part of a universal vision. And partly, there is a vision in Israel, as you say, of Ben Gvir, of Netanyahu, of Smotrich today, and all of these guys. And of course, the ultra-Orthodox, which is a different story, that doesn't see Israel as part of the universal kind of like mystique of the United States. So, and in between, of course, there is an American Jews, and that's my last point. I have written extensively about the Israelization of Judaism. It's not a triumphant moment, but it's a fact that American Jews, if they are not religious and ultra-Orthodox or even religious Zionists, whatever, have a very difficulty to sustain their ethnicity. And Shaul Magid's latest work was kind of like almost becoming anti-Zionist is the legacy of liberal Judaism. I don't know if it is or not, but it's clear-cut that for decades, American Jewry could not hold its own identity without Israel. Israel was a key factor. Can American Jewry hold an identity without Israel? Is holding an identity, I mean, institutionally speaking, I'm very doubtful. And of course, I say enough, but of course, there is a whole reshuffling in Jewish institutions in America. I myself now am heading a task force and think about these issues with others, but it's a very, very delicate moment. That's what I'm saying. And this war that we're now witnessing and other events that are unfolding certainly will shape what will happen next.
So thanks, Yossi. It reminds me, right, because the late American Studies scholar Amy Kaplan wrote in her book, right, she called it an invincible victim, right?
Yes.
Kind of that's Israel's kind of that dilemma that you mentioned. Dov, please, what do you write? I'll just remind, right? So we were thinking, what role, if any, does Israel, right, in Israel's behavior, actions, lack of actions, have contributed or not to this moment, please?
Well, certainly, I think Israel does play a role. I think sometimes there's a temptation in Israel among Jewish Israelis, particularly, to kind of ascribe the shifts in public opinion around the world and in the United States to exogenous factors. It's nothing to do with Israel. I think it is important to recognize both. It's certainly, there are long-term trends, long-term shifts that are taking place in the United States that have contributed to this shift in American attitudes. Things like political polarization, obviously, between Republicans and Democrats, generational change, distance from the Holocaust, shifts in the media landscape. There's lots of factors, isolationism and nativism among Americans. All of these things, I think, play into this. But I don't think we should ignore or downplay the role that Israel, Israeli policies, and Netanyahu specifically have played. Particularly, I think, on the Democrat side. I think for Democrats, you know, this shift, which has really been going on for at least a decade, in many ways begins with Netanyahu's intervention in American domestic politics in 2015 when he went to Congress, you know, to campaign against the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, despite not being invited by the Obama administration. That act and other acts that he's done was seen to really basically align Israel with the Republican Party. So I think Netanyahu particularly has made Israel a more partisan issue in the United States by aligning so openly and closely with the Republicans, and that's helped. It's not been the only reason, but it's certainly one of the reasons that's soured many Democrats in support for Israel. The other, obviously, beyond Netanyahu is Gaza. And the war in Gaza, you know, as I said, already there was already a decline among Democrats in support for Israel. But, you know, watching the destruction of Gaza day after day, watching Israel's policies and the kind of humanitarian crisis in Gaza, all of that, particularly for Democrats, you know, has had a major impact. They're already, I think, seeing, you know, increasingly being more exposed to Palestinian views and to a Palestinian narrative. And then the war in Gaza, I think, has really undermined what was left of Democrat support for Israel. And that goes beyond Netanyahu. That's kind of, I think, in the eyes of many Democrats and many on the left, you know, it underscores this different values, that Israel isn't this kind of similar democracy committed to the same values that at least progressive Americans have. So I think the policy there is obviously very significant. Watching settler violence in the West Bank also contributes to this. All of the things that Israel has been doing and not doing vis-a-vis the Palestinians, I think, have played a major role on the Democratic side. I think it's less impactful on the Republican side. As I said, I think for the Republicans, in many ways, the issue of Israel is seen through the lens of kind of an America First lens. And the question is, you know, is it good for the United States? And I think there's that perception that, particularly because of Netanyahu's role in convincing Trump to go to war now, that, you know, Trump came into office saying he wasn't going to start any Middle East wars. He's reversed himself. And that's deeply unpopular with his base, with Americans on the right. And there's a kind of willingness to scapegoat Israel for that, to basically say, well, it's Israel's fault rather than Trump. So in that respect, I think, Netanyahu has played a role, but it also serves people like Tucker Carlson and others to kind of pin the blame for this unpopular war on Netanyahu rather than on Trump. And they don't want to come out really and attack Trump. He's still a kind of cult-like figure on the American right. And so, there is a kind of narrative that is quite popular to blame Netanyahu and blame Israel. So I think it's obviously both, but I think, fundamentally, Israeli policies, particularly toward the Palestinians, for some time have been eroding American support for Israel. And unless those policies change, there'll be a continued erosion of that support.
Right. So we'll come back to that question of is this is this a deterministic process, or is there a way to change that? Right. Again, I'm not sure, but I think here I'm giving the Israeli perspective. As the mainstream zeitgeist, even the Israeli media and the standard Israeli liberal, I wouldn't even say left, just the middle, if there is such a thing in Israel, but there is this tendency to not look inside, right? It's always someone else's fault in that sense. And you had and the Iranians are a terrible regime, and Hamas is a terrible, and Hezbollah, and they are terrible, and they should be fought and they should be defeated. But that is, it's not mutually exclusive to also looking inside. You mentioned the West Bank, the violence. I was in Detroit a few months ago, and I was speaking with students there. And Detroit, of course, has the largest Arab American population in the United States, and they were talking to me about Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and I was very surprised of how well versed they were. And that's the moment. I mean, I always knew they were dangerous for Israel, but that's the moment that I think Israelis don't understand, that that's the face of Israel, right? And if you see Israel as settler violence on a daily basis, right, in the West Bank, then why would you think that we have shared values? You would not want to have shared values with these people. And most Israelis don't understand that. They're like, oh, well, they don't represent most Israelis, even though they could. But they do, right? That's the thing, right? Motti, I want to talk about, Dov mentioned the American Jewish community. And I want to mention what's happening there, right? Are we able to measure, empirically at least, and to try to understand how the American Jewish community is breaking up or divided over Israel, right? I think Yossi also, of course, Yossi has a book about this. I remember that wonderful line by the great sociologist, the New York intellectual Nathan Glazer, right? One of my heroes, right? And he has that wonderful line from the 70s that after the 6-Day War, American Jews' religion was Israel, right? That's the new religion. Is that still the case today, right? Especially if we also think demographically, Motti, from your research?
Yeah, so I think Dov and Yossi are better people to answer this question. I do want to make two comments before I'll get to the question of American Jews. First of all, again, going back to generations, in our studies, we have realized that people above the age of 50 still view Israel as the victim. People below 50 view Israel as the aggressor, overall, generally speaking. And one thing that Israel is doing, which is really, really bad, and it's happening, unfortunately, almost every week or so, is attacks on Christians. It's happening all the time, attacking Christian nuns, attacking Christian institutions, and those attacks are reaching everywhere nowadays. And I think this is where it's really, really, really hurting the base. Yes, the evangelicals, the Christians. To see Israelis attacking Christians is really not a good image at all if you want to keep the base. And now talking about American Jews. So in our studies, we conducted this survey just a few months before October 7, and we asked the same questions, all the groups, evangelicals, Catholics, Jews, we asked the same questions so we can compare. And I told you that the average Christian answer to, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, where do you place your support, the average of those who say they support Israel is about 50%. When we asked this question, the Jews, the number was 75%. So the American Jews are the strongest supporters of Israel among all the other groups. But there are only 2% of Americans altogether. But I think there is a solid support for Israel among Jews. And
What about
at
the
least at the
generational
beginning of
shifts?
the war, the narrative was that Israel is the victim. And later, at the later stage, maybe the narrative flipped. But at the beginning, at least, it was viewed as Israel is the victim.
And you also see a generational divide there, right?
Yes, also
So-
among Jews,
So
absolutely.
by far, the younger the respondents are, the less connected and the less supportive they're going to be of Israel.
Yeah, so there are two views about how to treat this young age cohort. One is to think that these young people will never change their mind. They're all going to stay the same thing. And
That's
then
always the question about public opinion, right?
yeah. So the other opinion is that as they age, they become Republicans. This is more or less the argument. As people age, they become more to the right. So the Trump voters today are the hippies of the 1960s. Yes. So we don't know. It's probably going to be a mix of the two things. Some will move forward with them. Some will change. What we do know from our studies that we've been studying already almost 10 years, evangelicals, we can say that young evangelicals, as they age, they become less radical. We can already measure that, but they are still keeping some of those radical views that they held when they were young in college. So we're definitely going to see, as we predict that as we go along, the evangelical community is going to change, but we're going to see these changes, like say in 20 years, something like that.
And that's profound, right? Because if the
Yeah.
evangelicals are, and here I'm quoting a Dermel, right? This is his words, that they're the more important than even that the American Jews, right? He said that a few yeyears ago, that Israel should put all its weight on gathering support from evangelicals. If that is the case, right? If for whatever reason Israel is unable to reproduce the enthusiasm and support of the Jerry Falwell generation from the 80s, the 90s, and early 2000s, then in 10, 20 years, the most important block, certainly within the Republican Party, we're going to lose it. And then, what happens?
We're going to lose some of it. We're going to lose some of it.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I wanted to come back to the question of American Jews, right? And of course, this isn't something new. Dov mentioned this is a very long process. But certainly the Gaza war and even the Iran war now, I think, has placed many of them in a peculiar position, to say the least, especially with all of the accusations of, right, the so-called dual loyalty, and this fact that, wait, are you for Israel or for America? You kind of have to choose, right? And we've seen this. Certainly, if we mentioned Tucker and all these guys, but that's a very old discourse, this idea of dual loyalty. And I'm wondering how you guys see the American Jewish community's reaction to the war in light of the broader changes that have been going on. Dov, why don't we start with you?
Well, first of all, I think, Motti's been talking about survey data, so I'll bring in some other survey data. Yeah. The little data that we had, there was a survey that was conducted on behalf of J Street, the liberal pro-Israel group, in late March of American Jewish voters. And it found that 60% of American Jewish voters opposed the war.
60 or 16?
60, majority opposed, right. Which isn't surprising. Most Americans oppose it, and even higher levels of opposition among Democrats. Most Jews are Democrats. But I think it's still, important. I mean, generally, you might think, well, this would be something that maybe American Jews would be more likely to support than other Americans or other Democrats. But no, the majority oppose it. And their opposition is not just because they think this war was, maybe unnecessary, illegal from an American point of view and in terms of international law, but also because they actually, majority believe that the war won't improve Israel's security. Yeah. So one of the key shifts that's happened among American Jews, something I wrote about in my book Trouble in the Tribe a decade ago, was the increasing tendency of American Jews to not to distance themselves from Israel, but rather to disagree with what Israeli governments and indeed Israelis sometimes view as Israel's best interests. In other words, they remain attached to Israel, but they're much more willing to take their own view and less deferential to what the Israeli government says is in Israel's interests. So in this case, many American Jews, believe, or a third believed actually in that survey I mentioned, that the war with Iran will weaken Israel's security. So there's a kind of independence of it's not a question of not caring about Israel. They still care about Israel, but they form their own opinions and their own judgments about what's in Israel's best interest. So what's shifted is that unconditional support or uncritical support for Israel. I think the one other point I want to make in terms of both Jewish American attitudes towards Israel and wider American attitudes, just to respond to something that Motti was saying, I don't think simply asking, do Americans support Israel is a useful question. What we need to disaggregate is attitudes towards Israel as a country and Israelis, and attitudes towards the Israeli government. What we see is that most Americans in the survey data are still supportive toward Israel as a country and toward Israelis, right? What's changed is their attitude toward the Israeli government and Netanyahu personally. And here we do see a major shift, not in terms of attitudes towards Israelis, that Americans still feel broadly sympathetic to Israelis and like Israel, but there's an unfavorable view of Israel's government and of Netanyahu personally has increased. And that split between liking Israel but disliking its government and disliking its policies, that I think in many ways was pioneered by American Jews. They were the first to say, we care about Israel, we're attached to Israel, but being pro-Israel doesn't mean supporting the policies of Israel's governments. American Jews have come to that position over the last 2 decades or so, and now we're seeing more and more Americans in general arriving at that position, saying we care about Israel, but we don't like what its government is doing. We care about Israelis, but we don't think that means we should unconditionally support whatever Netanyahu wants to do. And so that's the split that's changing. It's not just that Americans are abandoning Israel, just as American Jews haven't abandoned Israel, but they're much more willing to disagree and say, and challenge the policies of the Israeli government, whether that's toward Iran now or especially towards the Palestinians.
If I may, I think
please.
to build on that, I think Dov is right, and I think the best data that I have seen in recent months was by this woman named Alexandra Fishman. She runs a data center for Stand With Us. So then she's she just ran a conference on data and the Jewish American people a month and a half ago, something like that, a month ago in Las Vegas. And I attended it, and it was, as you said, and it was really interesting to see the data. The data is important here to understand really what is going on with American Jewry. But it's clear cut also how American Jews are being organized. I think that the fact, on the one hand, they cannot do without Israel, whether they support Israel or criticize Israel. It's always it's a very important point to make. Unless the organization is completely on a religious level, ethno-religious level, which is less and less so, of course, for liberals, because ethno-religious level is not what characterizes American liberals, American Jewish liberals. So that is a very important point to make in terms of the affinity and the support. The point that she makes, and it's very interesting, and I think Dov alluded to it perhaps in his findings. On the one hand, there is a deep understanding that being an American Jew, whatever it means, and its vulnerabilities, we support Israel. Israel is the construct of Israel and Zionism is a very important factor for American Jews. And she shows a very high percentage, I guess around 80%, something like that. But when it comes to identity, involvement, and deep kind of like yearnings in a different fashion, it collapses along the lines of religiosity and non-religious Jews. And when you see religious Jews, you will see heightened support for Israel. When you see non-religious Jews, there is a declining numbers on that score, and that's a very important factor to be remembered. The second point is, of course, Israel is changing rapidly. Not only America is changing rapidly. And the questions that American Jewry that are asking about Israel, I'm not sure they're the same question which were asked almost maybe 20 or 10 or from the Oslo time on. You know, the issue of the Palestinians, which used to divide American Jews in some ways, maybe are still salient, but they are less and less significant for the discussion, perhaps in the long run, because either by detour, perhaps we'll be lucky enough that there will be the Abraham Accords will expand and maybe Saudi Arabia will sign a deal in a few months and so on. And then there will be something else in the Middle East. We don't know. But the question is about what we call Jewish morality. American Jews have a very important rupture with Israel and what it means Jewish morality, as I write about it. On the one hand, liberal American Jews have lost their anchor in terms of what Jewish morality is all about. It's no longer the organization, the traditional organization of Bnei B'rith or American Jewish Committee or American Jewish Congress, which were holding into sort of civil rights in America. They're no longer having this power in America in articulating this kind of championship of these causes. They're very much on the margins of these issues. They've become more Israelized, as I said. At the same time, they were moving into a more universal idea. We talked about it for so long, about tikkun olam, kind of a universal vision, which is very much detached from what is happening in Israel, or is kind of holding the Palestinian, the Beinart style. But very few are holding to that in terms of how many numbers of Jews who are engaged and are holding to that in the reform movement, etc. And at the same time, in Israel, we have moved away from the liberal tradition of morality into what I call the raison d'être, the state morality. The state morality is, of course, security, but we have also in Israel a departure from state morality, which is only security and what we call mamlachtiyut, statism, into morality of Ben Gvir and Smotrich on all kind of things. They're talking about Jewish power, otzma yehudit, Jewish power, which is completely devoid. And looking at liberalism, as Makor Rishon, for example, had it only 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, by former editor Segal, who basically called on American Jewish liberals to go sink in the sea, as Rabbi Druckmann said to him, the late Rabbi Druckmann, our brothers and sisters are sinking, and you are suggesting it's a good development because we have the evangelicals on our side. This is a huge rupture that one cannot underestimate, and American Jews who are coalescing around the big issue of anti-Semitism. They understand that not only there is an Israelization of their identity, but there is also an explosion of anti-Semitism that they could not see rising aside from Israel. It's not only Gaza, and it's not only the genocide, so quote unquote, or whatever. There is some enmities that are allowing themselves to be surfaced now with impunity, with danger. And this is something that we see now in the book that David Harris just published in Oxford University Press on anti-Semitism, and others are articulating. And this is something American Jews have not witnessed before. They've witnessed attack on Israel. They've witnessed all kind of like criticism of Israel after the Gulf War, the Iraq War and so on, and the involvement of neocons and so on. Something else is happening in America vis-a-vis Jews. And this is something that we will have to see how it unfolds. And I don't have the answers for this, but it's certainly a new era in the relations of American Jewry vis-a-vis the United States, with a declining power of Jewish institutions to impact American politics and perhaps civic life in general.
So I want to come back to the question of Israel and American Jews, and then maybe we'll one more, and then we'll take a few from the audience. It seems to me that there has been such a transformation in the meaning of Israel for many Americans, and in a sense, is it possible that for the question here is beyond Israel? It's the question of what it means to be Jewish, right? Because much of your research, Yossi, has tied Israel to modern Jewish identity, certainly since 1967. And you said, well, you can't define your Jewishness as an American without a certain relationship to Israel. Mostly it was a positive relationship, but you know, I'm a historian. One of the most interesting things that have happened, I think, in the last decade is that there's been an outcrop of books, right, among historians of American Judaism that have suddenly, right, Jeffrey Levine and Marjorie Feld and Eric Alterman, my friend, right, so these books are very important because they say, wait, there's a whole other Jewish America, right? I'm sure, Dov, you know these books as well, right?
Yes.
Which is quite, they call themselves liberal, right? The American Council for Judaism is, of course, that was always the leading organization, and they were anti-Zionist. And they were always anti-Zionist, and they said Israel is kind of antithetical to American Jewish identity, right?
But
In
it's
that
on the
sense.
margins, Yoav. These are all, I would argue, and I'm not belittling them, but
Well, they were on the margins. The question now, I think, is
I think
they're not.
Paul Magid's book about kind of the articulation of new American identities and so on was more kind of a wishful thinking, and he himself will admit. You know, if you look at Putnam's book American Grace from 2010 about American religion, you see the decline, and you know, and it's not just like a triumphant Israeli statement vis-a-vis American Jews. We know. Yesterday I was sitting on Zoom again with leaders of with people from the conservative movement, and the synagogues are being depleted. The numbers are people who are attending conservative synagogues in the United States are in sharp decline. So there are lots of challenges to the liberal version of Judaism that comes with Herman Cohen's kind of ideology, but because ethnicity has declined so much. I'm not talking about intermarriages, ethnicity declines. So Israel is, of course, a very important factor into this equation, but how to revive it and how to move ahead, not just like for his anti-Semitism as a unifying feature, but something else growing without Israel is becoming very, very difficult for American Jews who are non-affiliated, who are not religious, and whose ethnicity is being, dissipating in the American melting pot.
But that's also the majority of American Jews. I mean, Motti, do you want to jump in with this?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and what our numbers kind of teach us about that. And so we used the 11 tropes of the ADL in a survey we conducted in 2024. So the ADL developed like 11 kind of anti-Semitic tropes to identify, anti-Semitism. And we also added to that a few anti-Israeli statements like Israel committed genocide and I support BDS completely and all kinds of things. And then we kind of like try to figure out what triggers anti-Semitism, like overall from all the questions that we have developed in the survey. And I just want to say that the most common tropes that people agreed with in our survey was the dual loyalty trope. And the second one was
this is the survey is the general population or Christians or
the Christians, the Christians. And I just wrote it to myself and forgot what I wanted to say. The dual loyalty and the Holocaust, yes. The Jews talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. So these are the most common, the strongest tropes that were among the overall Christian population survey that we have conducted a year ago. And then when we try to tease out, what triggers anti-Semitism, what came the most important is anti-Zionism, meaning people who hate Israel are the most likely to support anti-Semitic tropes. And then the second category was Christian anti-Semitism, which like if you like believe the old Christian notions of like the Jews, Christ killers and things of that sort, if you agree with them, or that the church replaced Judaism with the heavenly blessings, this has been the second one. And we saw interesting also demographic thing here. First of all, young people would likely to accept anti-Semitic tropes at a higher level than older people. And we saw it also with Hispanics. And this kind of ties us to the Catholic tradition.
So can you say something about Catholics? Because I think we don't talk enough about this. Well, we talk about the Protestants, the evangelicals, right? But the largest growing, right? The largest growing, I think, religion in America is right. I mean, within Christianity, is Catholics, both because of Hispanics, right? But also just the Catholic Church itself it has a lot of converts and it's expanding. And of course, just if we think about the elite positions. It used to be that the Supreme Court was disproportionately Jewish, of course, but today's Supreme Court is disproportionately Catholic. Almost everyone there, right, with the exception of I think Kagan and Katanya Brown Jackson. Everyone there's Catholic, right, and that is not representative, right? That's disproportional. But what are the Catholic views on Israel? Because it is very different than evangelicals, right? It's much weaker support.
Yeah. So first we have to say 60 million Americans identify as Catholic. So that's about 20% of the population. Yeah. And about 1/3 of them are immigrants from South America. So yeah, so we have to put it in proportion. So Catholics of European descent, we call it like that, have a stronger views of Israel and Jews than Catholics coming from South America, which are more influenced by the traditional Catholic view of Jews as, as bad people.
Yeah.
And so what I would like to say is this: the Roman Catholic Church has kind of amended its views about the state of Israel, about Jews, in 1960.
Right, Vatican II, certainly.
Vatican II, they took the blame out of Jews from crucifying Jesus, but not all Catholics agree with the Pope. We have to understand that what the elite are saying not necessarily filters down to the pews, and the Catholic the pews are quite divided among all kinds of theological questions. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Catholic Church has developed an opinion of support both, yes. Not supporting one over the other, supporting both. And those views tend to be reflected also in the data that we have collected in America, in which overall more Catholics support Israel rather than the Palestinians, which is kind of like an American thing. Yeah. But among Catholics, the numbers are lower and support for the Palestinian is higher.
And there is also, I think, higher anti-Semitism, right? I remember reading some other of the surveys that there's still, because you mentioned this more traditional anti-Semitism that a lot of Hispanic immigrants brought with them, which is very different than Irish Catholics or Italians or these ethnic immigrant communities that are already third, fourth, fifth generation in the U.S.
Yeah, so this is basically the reflection of the fact that, although the Pope gives orders to all kinds of opinions, it doesn't necessarily filters down. And among especially Hispanic Catholics, the traditional, views of Jews that are negative, still resonate among them, like Christ killer or the church replaced.
And this is very important, yeah. Especially if we're looking ahead, right? There's going to be a Hispanic president, probably.
But what we have seen also with the data, that the more those immigrants are becoming Americans, the more they stay in America, the more they are Americanized, So their
also opinions, in terms of their views on Israel.
Yes, definitely. So, and we also have to take into account only one last sentence is that also many Catholics are now converting to Protestant Christianity, especially the Pentecostal church.
Pentecostalism, right.
And Pentecostal is a big supporter of Israel. So in South America, Pentecostals are having really a big growth, and this is the reason why we see suddenly South America, all kinds of places are starting to flip toward Israel.
So then the question is, what is more defining of the attitudes towards Israel? Is it going to be religion? Right, if I'm a Catholic, or now if I become Pentecostal, or is it going to be my ethnicity, right, which Yossi mentioned before, and all the the predisposed maybe bigotries that I might have concerning Jews, and then that would be a very interesting thing that's going to play out, I think, in American politics in the coming years. All right, let me get one final question, and then we'll do an audience question. And Dov, let me start with you. And also some of the questions we received from the audience is about this, so I could bunch a few together. And it's the Democratic Party, right? You're out in Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yes.
Right, at UCLA now. And of course, the great question is what is going on with the Democratic Party? We mentioned the vote, right, in April, where 40 out of 47, that's a significant majority, opposed this, right, this recent weapons transfer to Israel, something which was just unthinkable, I think, a year ago even, right? And it's just the idea that Bernie Sanders is now kind of leading the line in terms of Israel policy in the Democratic Party, rather than someone like Chuck Schumer, right? Or kind of this more traditional pro-Israel senators. What is happening within the party, right? You're a governor, right? Gavin Newsom, right? I think he said something a couple of months ago along the lines of comparing Israel to an apartheid state, and then he walked it back. But I mean, this would have been unimaginable 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, the Democratic Party is the party that gets Israel created. We forget about that, right? It's Truman and it's the labor unions. These are Israel's best friends, and they've always been, really, until the recent years. What is happening in the party?
Well, I think, first of all, this has been a long-term shift. I mean, really, we can see the kind of beginning of this in the early 2000s, actually, during the Second Intifada, and then it really accelerates after 2015, and as I mentioned before, Netanyahu's intervention and alignment with the Republican Party. But yeah, I think absolutely there is a profound shift that's taken place among Democrats. It's not just among grassroots Democrats. It's now reaching, as you noted in the recent vote, it's now reaching to Democrats in the Senate, and indeed any would-be Democratic candidate for president in the 2028 presidential elections. People like Pritzker and Gavin Newsom have, are much more willing to kind of openly voice criticism and disagreement. Criticism of Israel, disagreement with the Israeli government, and distancing themselves from AIPAC, which is also very significant. Yeah. Now, it's become almost a requirement for Democrats to running for office to forswear any support from AIPAC. So yeah, that. I think that is primarily. I think there are many reasons that are driving this, but I think this shift is in many ways because of Israel being seen through the lens of the conflict with the Palestinians, and that is, in the eyes of many Democrats, one of the major human rights issues of our time. And essentially, because as long as Israel kind of continues to occupy the West Bank and Palestinians don't enjoy equal rights there, Democrats, the idea of equal rights and liberal values is core of their kind of political worldview, are gonna not agree with U.S. support for Israel. So there is a pronounced shift, and I think that's going to continue. It's very easy for people to kind of blame this on anti-Semitism on the left. Certainly that exists, but I think, we're not talking about when we're talking about mainstream centrist Democrats.
Yeah, that's very important to say.
We're not just talking about the far left fringe any longer. And so I think it demonstrates that, the extent of the shift, and that it's really a long-term shift. That's not going to change. But as I said, I don't think we should just see this as Democrats turning against Israel. Most Democrats are still sympathetic toward Israelis, right? And there was a recent Pew survey that showed that they make a distinction. What they oppose are the policy of Israeli governments, right-wing Israeli governments, and the policies of those governments, especially towards the Palestinians. That's the shift. So if there was which is very unlikely, admittedly, but if there was a pronounced shift in Israeli policy, you could win back some, at least the centrist Democrats, at least the moderate Democrats. One other point I want to make with the Democrats, contrary to what I think was true in the past, it is no longer a generational divide. It used to be a divide between younger and older Democrats. What the surveys show now is that older Democrats have also changed their attitudes toward Israel. They also see Israel unfavorably now. So it's now Democrats in general are actually less divided about Israel than Republicans are becoming. Democrats are now more unified in opposing Israeli government policies and opposing unconditional US aid to Israel. That's now a consensus view among Democrats. It's Republicans now that we're seeing the cracks emerge and beginning to grow.
And that's very consequential.
Can I say one word, Yoav? Just one word. I think that again, Dov touches on a very important issue here. We have seen something which is happening because of Israeli government, that it's not that the Democrats just abandoned Israel in that respect. It's that the Israeli current government abandoned the Democrats. One has to understand. Distanced himself from the Democrats. We have seen a process here. The attack that the Democrats saw, Netanyahu against Obama, it's a very important issue. And nevertheless, after October 7th and after Biden came to power, American policymakers were completely in line with Israel's interest and Israel's needs in a most passionate manner that one can imagine. And I've seen it firsthand with Biden, with Blinken, with Austin, and had very cordial relations with this government, not a different government, on the needs of Israel, albeit the war in Gaza kind of like made lots of issues pertaining to weapons and some articulations. But the enmity was also vis-a-vis this government. This is not for the first time. If you look at Clinton's second term, he also articulated this kind of reservations about Netanyahu, but they remain there. And you could see Obama speaking only this week about Netanyahu pushing him to go to war with Iran, which he did not. And therefore, there is a room for correction here. And yet, the Democratic Party itself, it's not all about Israel, has went in a completely different direction with forces that are completely outlandish in their perceptions of the conflict, in their perceptions of American needs, in their perception of American national interests. And that kind of like politics of what people call progressives or is changing also the Democratic Party, which is finding it very difficult to find a focus in international relations, to find causes in international relations. And this is absolutely hindering the Democratic Party to gain support for large segments of the American public on issue of foreign policy. Biden, people describe him as the last sort of Democratic Zionist. And we see even Schumer kind of like doesn't know what to do. But I don't think this is the end of the game. Because after all, in terms of strategic interest, Israel will still be the number one strategic ally of the United States in the Middle East. On the question of values, which is a big issue between America and Israel, here we will see lots of shifts, not just because of what we described about Israel shifting, is also because about America. What are the democratic values are? Do Kamala Harris versus maybe Joe Shapiro? I don't know what will happen. So yet to be seen. And I think, and we said it and I repeat myself, sorry, from the beginning, this war and the results of this war will have to do a lot with how things will be seen. And we don't have yet the full results. I hope we'll have them soon, because the lingering is not good for Israel or for that matter for the for America. So we will see how things are. But certainly, last but not least, we talked about the younger generation. We are witnessing a challenge, a major challenge to Israel. The number one program which was working for Israel and American Jews, Taglit, Birthright Israel, is now in a complete in disarray because they cannot come for a long time. And the organization itself is suffering. And this is something we will have to see. Many such programs are now suffering. Lots of things will have to be rebuilt from the start. And many people are thinking about it and don't know yet what will be the core values around which to coalesce. Because in Israel itself, as many Israelis are saying, there is kind of a cold civil war in Israel about these values. So lots of things will be determined not only domestically in Israel on the domestic front, but also in terms of what Israel will project in the international system.
So, Motti, do you want to jump in and say something about the left?
I think what was said was very good, very articulated.
Okay.
But I just want to say, I agree very much with what has been said. I think that if a new narrative will come from Israel to the world, if there's going to be new peace treatments, if there's going to be things of that sort, I think much of the damage, not much, but some of the damage could be repaired.
So all right, so I'll take one audience question there. Well, because we had a few about the Democratic Party, which was addressed. We have a few about anti-Semitism, which was addressed. And so maybe we'll conclude with the question. I think everyone.
I get a note from someone who wanted to ask a question. So
The-
maybe you want to ask the audience if they want to ask questions.
Well, the audience are through social media. They're sending it to the center
okay.
staff. But I think there's one here that a few people are interested in, and Yossi, you mentioned this. Most of you are relatively optimistic, which is nice. I'm not. It's quite so. It's uplifting in the sense that I think everyone here agrees that if and when a new government, takes power in Israel, when I don't know when is it, in October, I think we're supposed to have an election, right? And in the end of this year, and it changes its policies, which again, I don't foresee even a Bennett government suddenly, embracing Oslo or whatever, or a new peace process or anything like that. But if Israel changes its behavior, right? And then it brings us to this question that we started with, Yossi. It's still a very important strategic ally, maybe the most important strategic ally in the region. But what happens if the values that you mentioned, right? And this has always been, right, the foundation of U.S. Israel relations, right? It's always tied to these two pillars, right? It's the strategic and the domestic political one, rooted in shared values, and of course, the pro-Israel forces such as AIPAC and evangelicals. But we have this division, right? That on one hand, the strategic is stronger than ever, but the values, the domestic political support is weaker than ever. All of you suggest, I think, that this can be corrected to some extent, that there is kind of some optimistic possibility. So maybe I think I'd like to conclude just with this question. How do we rebuild? Because I think all of us agree that there is a fundamental problem in the relationship, and the Iran war only exacerbated it. Can all of you maybe give one suggestion or point to just one thing that both, I don't know, Israelis, Americans, policymakers, civil society, religious organizations, that we can do to try to rebuild this relationship?
I think you can build this relationship very quickly once this war is over. And if American foreign policy and Israel's collaboration with America lead to extension of the peace with the Abraham Accords to other countries in the region, above and beyond with Saudi Arabia, and we'll have some arrangement perhaps in Gaza, whatever it is, immediately you will see shifts taking place, because it will empower American Jews, and it depends also who is elected in America. We have midterm elections. I don't think they will impact a lot, but these are big issues. So I think that nothing is certain, but if indeed there will be kind of deterioration, if, for example, Israel, we know what happened with the Biden administration during the judicial reform or judicial revolution in Israel. Yeah. They became very upset about, like Israelis, many Israelis. Yeah. If we see that Israel is fractured, if we see that something is happening and there is no shift in Israel, and it's the cold civil war that Israel is experiencing is flaring up more, of course, there will be a big issue. But the question of values is not only an Israeli question, it's very much an American question. What are the values Americans are sort of like also espousing in this stage? And this is the divide in America is certainly will have a mirror image on what is happening in Israel.
Dov, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I first of all, I'm not that optimistic, because I don't think Israeli behavior is likely to change dramatically in the way that it might satisfy some in the United States. But in terms of what could change, first of all, I think for the last 2.5 years, Israel's been engaged in constant warfare and fighting both, obviously in Gaza, in Lebanon, against the Houthis in Yemen, and now in Iran. So moving from a position of kind of constant war to peace would obviously, make a profound shift, not just on American support for Israel, American attitude toward Israel, but around the world, right? If Israel is seen as really committed to pursuing peace, first and foremost with the Palestinians, and not starting wars with Iran or continuing one in Lebanon, that would make a big difference. I think from the American point of view as well, the changing the nature of the relationship, so it's less about U.S. aid, military aid to Israel, and it's more about cooperation rather than handouts to Israel, which is something that generates resentment on the American right, that Israel is seen as a kind of undeserving recipient of American taxpayers' dollars. That would also make a big difference. And I think in general, if Israel's kind of presented a very different face to the world would obviously, and Americans would look upon Israel differently. I don't happen to think those things are likely to change with one election in October. There can be some shifts, and I think when Netanyahu leaves, he alone has been responsible in part for this decline, as we've said, and so certainly his departure would change things. But I don't think we should fool ourselves into believing that one election in October, even if it produces a different government, is likely to dramatically change things, because there are deeper divergences between Israeli society, between how Israel understands itself and how Americans see it. One final point I want to very briefly mention. I don't think it's simply the case that American and Israeli interests, strategic interests, are aligned. Right now they're aligned, but the longer thing is that America wants to shift its strategic attention towards Asia Pacific. And Israel wants America to keep its attention focused on the region, on the Middle East. So I think strategically there is also a possibility for divergence after this American administration. Right now we have the US fighting another Middle Eastern war, but the American strategic interests are not the same as Israel's strategic interests. And that, I think, means that there will be tension in that respect, as well as between their policies.
All right, and that down the road is also a great source of a possible, right, a kind of a certain shock to the relationship. Motti, do you want to final thoughts on this point as well? Have you found certain things that for the especially in the survey data, that if Israel changes certain things, it can lead to different attitudes?
Yeah, so I want to say maybe a few words about Tucker Carlson and the world that he lives in, yes, which is the social media. Yeah. So what Tucker Carlson is doing is potentially can be very damaging to Israel, because he's trying to not just attack Israel's policies and this and that. He is also trying to attack the foundational views of many Republicans on scriptures and what's the role of Jews in scriptures. And this is something that Israel should pay attention to, because this is a way to loosen their evangelical base, to try to argue with them not about policies but about scriptures. And he's been doing that. And so just one point to make, and also to think about the generational issues that are happening in America, in which is younger people tend to be less supportive of Israel overall, whereas the older generation is more supportive of Israel. And to understand, I hope in Israel someone understands that with young people you need to speak through different platforms, through different ways, in a different, you have to think as young people think. If you want to explain Israel's actions, if you want to do hasbara, yes, you have to do it in a way that speaks to young people, and not through Fox News. That, by the way, people who watch Fox News tend to be 70 and above, just by the way.
Trump, right? That's the president's crowd. Yeah. That's Trump.
So to understand, CNN and Fox News and all traditional TV is basically speaks to the older generation, which is already with Israel. Anyways, young people are not there. They're not watching this. And Israel needs to find a way to reach these young people through the platforms of social media.
So I just want to emphasize your point, because we think about policy, and Motti's point is so important, because the theological underpinnings of the evangelical support for Israel are rooted in scripture and in a certain interpretation of the Old Testament. And I agree with you. One of the things that Tucker has done and is doing very successful is something that I've noticed already the critics of Israel on the right have tried to do in the last 20, 30 years, and it's undermined the theological, right? The theological connection between evangelicals and Israel, and that, as Motti suggests, can be a game changer, at least in swaying younger evangelical opinion towards Israel. So
Yeah.
I want to
Happening.
take the opportunity to thank all of my guests, Yossi, Dov, and Motti. I learned a lot. I think it was fascinating. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot tonight, and those viewing it on Tau's YouTube channel. So once again, I want to thank everyone for your participation. I want to thank the audience, and I wish everyone a good night.
Thank you.
Good.